The armored transport moved through the pass at exactly 3 kilometers per hour, the way they always moved through the Vethkara corridor, slow enough to scan for insurgents, fast enough that the cold couldn't ice the grav rails. Nobody sabotaged the corridor. Nobody was that stupid. The Keth Varun Directorate had held this mountain range for 11 years, and in 11 years they had learned one thing about the species they had conquered. Humans did not fight in the cold. Lyra had been in the cage for 14 months. She kept count by scratching the wall beside the cot they gave her, not the wall she could reach from lying down, which would have been too obvious, but the wall behind the oxygen cycler where the guards only looked during inspections. She had scratched 142 into the metal and then stopped, not because she had given up, because counting had begun to feel like surrender, like she was measuring a life rather than living one. She sat cross-legged on the cot with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, and she did the thing the Directorate did not know she could do. She listened. Not with her ears. Her ears heard the low harmonic thrum of the transport's grav engines, the creak of the coupling between her wagon and the forward car, the distant tapping of a guard's boot against a bulkhead. What she listened with had no name in the Keth Varun language. In the 3 human languages she spoke, the closest word was probably feel, which was too soft, or sense, which was too clinical. Her grandmother had called it the deep quiet, because to use it you had to go very still inside, and the world would fill that stillness like water filling a cupped hand. She sent it forward through the walls. 2 guards in the connecting corridor. One nervous, she could feel the tight sparking shape of his anxiety like a live wire. The other calm, which meant either experienced or stupid. She sent it backward and found 6 more soldiers in the rear car, weapons racked, cards on a table. She sent it down through the floor and felt the mountain under the grav rails, cold and enormous and indifferent, and she felt something else too, something she had not felt in 14 months. Another human, ahead in the sealed forward compartment. She had known he was there distantly, the way you know there is someone in a dark room without being able to see them. She had assumed, the way the Directorate wanted her to assume, that he was another prisoner, another piece of leverage, another number in a containment file. But now, pressed close against the edge of her deep quiet, she could feel what was in him, and it was not anything she had a word for. It was not fear, and it was not rage, and it was not despair. It was something dormant, a sleeping weight, like a mountain range folded inside a single human body, patient and cold and waiting for the thaw. She opened her eyes. The lock on her cell door was a Keth Varun biometric seal, a flat panel of crystallized sensor resin that read the molecular signature of the authorized user's palm. The guard's hands, the doctor's hands, not hers. The Directorate was thorough about things like that. They had studied human anatomy for 11 years, and they knew where the hands went and what they did, and they had built their security accordingly. What they had not studied, because they did not know it existed, was what happened when Lyra pressed her palm flat against the sensor panel, and went very still inside and let the deep quiet move through the resin like a warm current through cold water. The panel made a sound like a sigh. The door opened. She moved fast and quiet through the connecting corridor. The nervous guard turned at exactly the wrong moment and she hit him with her elbow across the base of his skull. A move her father had taught her father who had been a soldier before the occupation, who had shown her the blow in the kitchen of their house in the lowlands and said, soft voice, serious eyes, "You'll never need this." And then the Directorate had come, and she had needed it twice. The guard folded. The calm one had time to reach for his weapon, and she took it from him before he could bring it up, and she did not use it the way it was designed to be used. She used the butt end, and he sat down against the wall with his eyes crossed. Ahead forward car, the sealed compartment. The door here was not a biometric seal. It was a pressure lock with a manual override, a heavy wheel set into the hull, the kind you needed 2 full rotations of to release. Lyra turned it once, and a hiss of pressurized air escaped from the seam. She turned it again and the door swung out. The smell hit her first. Antiseptic and copper and something else underneath. Something organic and green-edged, like new growth pushing up through ice. And then she saw him. He was strapped to a vertical frame in the center of the compartment. A human man, young, maybe 20, maybe younger. His head hung forward and his hair was dark and lank with sweat, and across his forearms and collarbones the skin had been opened and closed so many times that the scar tissue had formed in ridges, like bark on a tree. He wore the gray directorate patient suit, the kind they put on subjects, not prisoners. The difference mattered to them. She stepped into the compartment. "Hey." He didn't move. "I know you're awake, I can feel it." A pause. Then he raised his head slow, like lifting something very heavy, and he looked at her with eyes that were the color of deep water, blue-gray, shadowed, carrying something in their depths that she couldn't name but that she recognized. The way you recognize a scar on someone else's body that matches your own. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question. The flat syntax of someone who has been asked and has answered so many times that the sentence has lost its interrogative shape. "My name is Lyra. I'm opening these straps. When I do, I need you to walk." "Can you walk?" He looked at her for a moment that stretched. "I don't know what I can do anymore." "That's fine," she said. "We'll find out together." His name was Davin Sarek. He told her this in small pieces across the next 2 hours as they moved through the frozen mountain pass on foot, following the rail bed east toward the lowlands. He had been a student, he said, aerospace engineering, 3rd year before the occupation. The directorate had taken him from a transit camp 3 months after the fall. He had been in their facilities since then. How long was difficult to say. He had lost the thread of the count. "What did they do to you?" she asked. He walked beside her with his hands pushed into the sleeves of the gray suit against the cold. The pass was narrow here, the mountain walls rising sheer on either side, and the stars above them were extraordinary. The kind of stars you only saw at altitude, clear and blazing and indifferent to everything below. "You know what a parasite is," he said. "In the biological sense. They found something in deep survey. Out past the 4th ring, the debris belt beyond the outer planets, some kind of organism. It was dormant in the sample, inert. When they introduced it to a living system, he paused. It woke up. It adapts to its host environment, learns to read the host's nervous system. Reads the threat profile." He stopped walking and held up one of his forearms, and she saw, along the ridge of the scar tissue, the faint trace of something vascular but not quite vascular, the branching network of something that had rooted itself through his body the way roots root through soil. They called it the Bayer sequence. The organism isn't just a parasite, it's a system. It rewrites. It has been rewriting me for, he counted something in his head, 11 months, I think. Lyra looked at the branching traces on his arm. The deep quiet told her nothing about them. They were beyond its vocabulary. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. To me. He thought about this. "I don't know," he said, which she had already begun to understand was his honest mode, the response he gave when he meant it, as opposed to the flat recitation he gave when he was still somewhere deep inside himself. "The directorate thinks I am. They were very careful about containment, but they have been wrong about things before." "What things?" "They thought I would not remember my name." She started walking again. After a moment he fell in beside her. "There was a crash," he said. "When they took me, a transport accident, I was in it. I died clinically before they got me to the facility. The organism is why I am alive." He said this the way you say the facts of a thing that has not yet become a story, the facts sitting loose and disconnected like parts on a workbench before assembly. "I don't know what I am now, I know what I was. I was Davin Sarek, 3rd year aerospace from the coast town of Vel. I had a sister. I liked bad coffee and early mornings. I knew 17 ways to plot a re-entry trajectory." He paused. "I don't know if those things are still true." I am still learning what has replaced them. They walked until the pass opened into a shelf of land at the tree line, sparse frostwood, the bark pale and the branches bare. Lyra found the ruins of a survey station half buried in a snowdrift, and they got the door open and sat inside with their backs against the wall. She had taken a thermal pack from one of the downed guards, and she cracked it and set it between them. "You're a psychic," he said. "Don't say that word." "Why?" "Because it's their word for it. They use it to mean property, something to be cataloged and used." She looked at the thermal pack's orange glow. "I open things, I feel things, that's all it is. It doesn't have a name that I'm willing to share with the directorate." He was quiet for a while. "My sister," he said. "Her name was Kale, is probably. She was 14 when I was taken. She would be," another count, "16 now, maybe 17. She was in the lowlands." "I don't know if she—" "I don't know either," Lyra said. "I can tell you that people are alive in the lowlands. I've felt it when they move me between facilities. The directorate hasn't put lights out everywhere. They've occupied us, not erased us." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," she said. "Ask me again in 10 years. He almost smiled. It was a very small thing, barely there, a faint flexion at one corner of his mouth, and then it was gone. But she had felt it in the deep quiet before she'd seen it on his face, and she filed it away, the fact that it was possible. The fact that whatever the directorate had done to him, they had not done that. They came for them before dawn. She felt them first, 3 vehicles on the approach road below the tree line, moving fast, their engines suppressed but not gone, and ahead of them the scout, a single directorate enforcer running the ridge with a scanner. She shook Davin awake with one hand on his shoulder. 3 minutes, she said. He came awake immediately, fully, the way soldiers do and the way most people don't, no transition, no drowsiness, just open eyes and then full presence. She found it slightly unsettling. She also found it useful. "How many?" "The vehicles hold 6 each, 18 soldiers plus the scout on the ridge." He stood. "Can you do anything with your—" "I can open the door when it's time. That's useful for exactly one thing." She looked at him. "What can you do?" The question landed differently than she'd meant it. She saw it in his face, the same thing she'd seen in the forward compartment when she'd asked if he could walk. Not evasion, uncertainty. The look of someone cataloging a list of capabilities they have not yet tested in conditions that counted. "I don't know the extent of it," he said. "The directorate has been careful to test me in isolation, lab conditions, controlled stress." "This is going to be uncontrolled," she said. "Yes." "Are you afraid?" He thought about this honestly. "Of what I might do, yes. Of them." He picked up a length of metal pipe from the station floor, an old survey strut, testing its weight in one hand. "No. And I think that might be the most frightening thing about what they've made of me." She put her hand on his forearm briefly, not the arm with the vascular traces, the other one. "You were already something before they made you into this. Don't lose sight of that." He looked at the pipe and then at her. "3rd year aerospace." "3rd year aerospace," she confirmed. The scout hit the ridge and she sent the deep quiet through the frozen ground and found him high, moving toward the survey station, scanner active. She turned to Davin. "Roof, he'll have eyes on us in 40 seconds. He moved without hesitation, and the thing she noticed, the thing she remembered afterward, was how quiet he was. Not careful quiet, the way a person is quiet when they are trying not to be heard. Quiet the way deep water is quiet, the silence of something with a great deal of mass that has not yet begun to move. The scout never made a sound. Davin came back through the door. There was no blood on him, which surprised her. His breathing was slightly elevated and his eyes had changed. The deep water color was the same, but the texture of what lay beneath was different, something more awake, something that had been watching the situation from inside him and had decided now was the moment to surface. The vehicles, he said. Coming up the access road, 2 minutes. Is there a back way? She had felt the terrain while they slept, a cut in the eastern wall. Tight, maybe 30 meters of exposed slope to cross before we're in the trees. We need to cross it before the vehicles arrive. If they have aerial surveillance. They do, but they'll weight it toward the road approach. He said this with the precision of someone who understands tactical logic, and she realized that 11 months in a directorate facility, even as a subject, meant 11 months of watching directorate methodology. He had been studying them the same way she had. The aerial coverage will be dense at the vehicles and sparse at the flanks until they establish perimeter. We have a window. She didn't ask how he knew, she just moved. They crossed the exposed slope at a run, low and fast, and she felt the aerial drone scan beam pass over them once, a flat, cold finger of electromagnetic attention. And then they were in the trees. Behind them she heard the vehicles reach the station, heard the Keth-Varun dialect of their deployment commands, clipped and resonant. The language had a harshness that her ear had never accommodated, even after 11 years of occupation. Deep in the frostwood they stopped. Davin put his back against a pale-barked tree and closed his eyes. She watched him. Something was happening in him. She could feel it at the edges of her deep quiet, not readable, not translatable into anything she had a word for, but present. A warmth, she thought. Which was strange, because the temperature was 14 below and falling. They're going to establish a perimeter and then compress, he said, eyes still closed. Standard directorate contain and neutralize. We have maybe 20 minutes before the gap closes. You can feel them. He opened his eyes. Not the way you can, I think. He looked at his hands. The vascular traces on his forearms had brightened slightly, visible now against the pale skin. It's more like a pressure, the direction of threat, like a compass but for danger. That's useful. Is it new or was it always there and I just wasn't listening? He didn't say it as a question, more as a problem to be turned over in the hands. Come on, she said, 20 minutes. They ran east through the frostwood. The trees thinned and then the land fell away sharply at a bluff edge overlooking the Midland Plateau, still high, still cold, but below the snow line the dead grass visible through a crust of frost, and in the far distance the lights of occupied Vel, her hometown and possibly his. 6 kilometers, maybe 7. They could cover it by dawn if they moved. They were halfway down the bluff path when the enforcer hit them. He came from above and to the left, the one she hadn't felt, because he had come in wide, outside the reach of the deep quiet, and arrived in a silence that suggested either luck or specific training in counter-psionic approach. He was large, even by Keth-Varun standards, and his equipment was different from the standard Death Squad kit, specialized, customized, the gear of someone who was sent after things the regular soldiers couldn't handle. He had weapons, and he had additional tools that she could see had been modified for anti-psionic work. A neural disruption rig on his wrist, a scanner with a broader frequency range than standard. He leveled the neural rig at her first. The pulse hit her like a wall of nothing, not pain, just the sudden erasure of the deep quiet, the sense-filling stillness stripped away in an instant, leaving her in a silence that was louder than any noise she'd ever heard. She went to one knee, her vision grayed at the edges. She heard Davin's voice, very steady, "Look at me." She didn't know if he was talking to her or to the enforcer. Then she heard the sounds, not combat sounds, not anything she had a reference for, and she understood he was talking to the enforcer. When her vision cleared, she saw why the enforcer's weapons were on the ground. She saw why his hands were where they were. She had felt Davin in the deep quiet before and found no word for it. She was not using the deep quiet now, and she still had no word for it. He was between her and the enforcer, and what she saw was not what she expected, which was the cold, clean violence of a trained operative. What she saw was something that moved the way weather moves, not choosing its path exactly, responding to the shape of the terrain, occupying every space available, the air blades extending from his forearms with a sound like a held breath released. His body changed into something that was not human, and was not alien but was some third category that maybe had never existed before this night on a frozen bluff above occupied Vel. The enforcer fought well. She could see that even from where she knelt. He fought with the training of something more than a standard soldier, the specialized technique of a hunter, the kind the Directorate deployed when they needed something dead that wouldn't die by ordinary means. He had clearly faced enhanced subjects before. He knew how to move against them. He pressed angles, changed timing, used his own enhanced frame as a weapon. But Davin had been made to fight things the Directorate didn't know how to defeat. It was over in less time than she needed to rise fully to her feet. The enforcer was on the ground and not dead. She was fairly sure he was not dead, because the shape of Davin's attention changed when the fight was done, some retraction, some returning inward, and she thought if he had killed the enforcer he would not have been able to do that. He stood with his back to her for a moment, the air blades still extended, the vascular traces on his arms fully lit now, the warmth she had felt before now a genuine heat radiating from him in the frozen air. Then slowly the blades withdrew. He turned around. His eyes were back to deep-water blue-gray, but calmer now, or not calmer exactly, but resolved, like a surface after a storm. "Are you hurt?" The rig knocked she pressed her fingertips to her temples. "It will come back, it always comes back." She looked at the enforcer on the ground. "Is he alive? He'll wake up in an hour." He paused. "I didn't want to kill him." "Did you choose not to?" A long pause. He seemed to be genuinely interrogating the question. "I don't know if I chose or if the organism chose. He exhaled. "That's the part I don't know how to answer yet." "When you figure it out," she said, "tell me." They went down the bluff. The lights of Vel grew as they walked, and the sky behind them went from black to purple to the cold pre-dawn gray that she associated, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, with hope. The gray before color, the sky's version of not yet. She told him about the occupation in pieces, the way you tell things to someone who already knows the shape of it but not the specific contour of your version. The transit camps in the first months. The way the Directorate had moved through the population centers with their scanners, flagging psionics, flagging anyone with a deviation reading above threshold on their bioregisters. How her grandmother had known somehow to hide her, had kept her in the basement of the house on the coastal road for 3 weeks while the sweeps went through, feeding her flatbread and dried fish and saying, over and over in the voice that brooked no argument, "You are not a weapon. You are not a number. You are my granddaughter and you will outlast them." "She was right," Davin said. "She's dead," Lyra said. The sweeps came back. "A second pass, someone in the neighborhood." She stopped. "She was right about me. She was wrong about them." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My sister." "We'll look." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. We'll look." The outskirts of Vel at dawn were half alive. That was the only word for it. The occupation had not flattened the town. The Directorate had a use for functioning population centers, which meant shops that opened and transit that ran and children that walked to school, but it had taken the color out of things. Everything had the quality of motion without momentum. People moved through the streets with their heads down and their eyes doing the small, continuous calculations of the occupied. Where are the checkpoints today? Which patrols are on which routes? How much can I carry before it draws attention? Lyra moved through it with the ease of long practice. She had spent her months between detentions learning to be unremarkable, the particular art of being exactly as visible as the context required and no more. She had taught herself to match her pace to the ambient pace, her expression to the ambient expression. She had never taught Davin this, and she couldn't teach him fast enough, and besides, he was still in the gray patient suit with the barked scar tissue on his forearms, which was not unremarkable under any circumstances. They found an abandoned freight depot 2 streets from the central market and got inside. Lyra pulled a tarp from a stack of crates and handed it to Davin. Cover the arms. Sit down. You look like you've been running all night. I have been running all night. Then look like something other than that. Look like you just woke up and aren't sure where you are. She paused. Actually, that's accurate. Are you making a joke? I'm noting a coincidence. She sat across from him on a crate. I need to find clothes for you, and then I need to find a contact. There are people here, a network. Not large, functional. They've been moving psionics out of the Directorate's reach for 18 months. You trust them? I trust one of them. One is enough. He looked at her with those deep-water eyes. You've been doing this for a long time. The trusting one person at a time thing, yes. The surviving thing. She thought about her grandmother's basement, the smell of dried fish and the sound of boots on the floor above. Since I was 12, she said. She left him in the depot with a length of pipe and instructions to use it only if the situation was unambiguous, then went out into the occupied streets of Vel, and was, for the next 2 hours, perfectly unremarkable. She found her contact, a woman named Asa who ran a bakery and had been, before the occupation, a military intelligence coordinator, and was now both of those things still. And Asa gave her clothes and bread and a location and a time, and she asked no questions because she was a professional and professionals ask only what they need to know. When Lyra returned to the depot, Davin was exactly where she'd left him, which she found reassuring. He was also doing something with his hands she hadn't seen before, a very small movement, repetitive, like a musician running scales. He stopped when she came in. What was that? He looked at his hands. I don't know what to call it, testing the range. The organism responds to specific, I don't know what to call them, inputs, biochemical, if I can find he turned his hands over. I was an engineer. I'm trying to understand what I am now as an engineering problem. She set the clothes down in front of him. Does that help? It helps more than the alternative. Which is? Not knowing and being afraid of it. She watched him for a moment. Something about the posture of it, the head bent slightly, the hands open in the lap, the quality of careful attention he brought to the examination of his own transformed body, reminded her of her grandmother in the basement, teaching her to use the deep quiet. Not the fear of the thing, not the suppression of it, the careful, patient study of what it was. Get dressed, she said. We move in an hour. The contact point was a decommissioned tram station on the eastern edge of the city, and Asa had 3 more people there. A former soldier who had lost 2 fingers to a Directorate scanner confiscation, and a young woman who was maybe 19 and a man who said nothing, and seemed to be waiting for a reason to say something. They looked at Davin the way people look at something that has not quite resolved into a recognizable shape. He looked back at them with the deep-water eyes and said nothing, and after a moment the former soldier nodded once, the way soldiers nod at things they have decided to accept. The route out of Vel was a maintenance tunnel under the Transit Authority building, emerging in a drainage channel that ran south toward the agricultural lowlands. Asa walked point and Lyra walked second and Davin walked at the rear, and the silent man, she never learned his name, walked just ahead of him, and somewhere in the 3rd hour of the tunnel, he started talking to Davin in a low voice, and Davin answered in the same register, and she didn't catch most of it, but what she caught was this. Both of them had been in facilities. Different ones. Both of them had been made into something, modified, altered against their will, used. And both of them had, so far, survived. She caught the word Vel from Davin. She caught the word sister. She caught a pause and then a name, Kale said once, with the quality of something held very carefully because it might break. The silent man said something she didn't catch. She heard Davin exhale. Heard him say quietly which coast. She let them talk. The tunnel emerged into a gray dawn that was almost identical to the one they had walked out of on the bluff, which she took as a sign of something, though she could not have said what. The agricultural lowland stretched to the south, bare fields under a skin of frost, the directorate's requisition flags bright red at the field boundaries, marking the land that had been seized. Everything beyond was technically free space. Technically. They were crossing the second field when the directorate carrier descended from the cloud cover. It came in fast and low, a military-grade atmospheric vehicle, and as it settled into a hover 200 meters ahead, she knew immediately from its configuration that this was not the standard response. The standard response had come at the mountain pass and again at the bluff, and she and Davin had outrun both. This was different. The shape of it was different. The way it moved was different, too precise, too targeted. Someone had upgraded the hunt. A figure stepped out of the forward hatch, while the carrier was still 2 meters off the ground, dropping the last distance with a casual disregard for the landing that told her everything she needed to know about the figure's augmentation. He was tall, even for a Kethvaran soldier, and he wore non-standard field equipment in a configuration she hadn't seen before, heavy modified, with what looked like integrated kinetic dampeners around the core and a psionic disruption array at the crown of the helmet. He hit the frozen ground and the ground gave slightly under him and did not spring back. He said something in Kethvaran that she translated without thinking. "The boy is mine. The rest of you can walk." Asa and the others had stopped. The former soldier had one hand on his weapon, but the other hand was held flat at his side in the universal gesture of wait, and she understood that he was experienced enough to know that drawing was not the move here. Davin stepped forward. He stepped forward in front of Lyra, past Asa, past the young woman, past the former soldier, and he stopped in the middle of the frozen field with 3 meters of frost-whitened ground between him and the directorate heavy. He was wearing the clothes she had brought him, ordinary clothes. A civilian coat, trousers, and the vascular traces on his forearms were covered by the sleeves, and in the gray dawn light he looked exactly like what he had been. A young man from the coast town of Vel, 3 years into an aerospace degree. Unremarkable, exactly as visible as the context required and no more. The directorate heavy looked him over with the slow, assessing attention of a professional. "There is no version of this where you leave," the heavy said, this time in human standard, which she found significant. He was speaking to be understood, which meant he was not only interested in compliance. He was interested in making Davin understand why compliance was correct. "The Bea sequence is too valuable. You are property of the directorate, and whatever you think you are now, you know that the organism dies when the host dies, which means you can be killed. You can be slowed and then killed. I have done it before." Davin stood in the frost and listened to all of this with his hands at his sides. "Are you afraid?" the heavy asked. It was almost the same question she had asked on the bluff, in the station, in the dark before the first assault. "Are you afraid?" She watched Davin's face from behind, and she could not see his expression, but she could see the quality of his stillness, which was the same quality she had noticed in the very first moment in the forward compartment. The weight of something dormant, the patience of something that had been waiting for the thaw. "Of you, no," Davin said, the same answer he had given her. "Of what I might do, yes." "That's meaningless," the heavy said. "No," Davin said quietly. "It means I still know the difference. That's a pause. That's not nothing." The heavy moved. She had seen the enforcer on the bluff, and she had thought the enforcer was fast, which he had been. But the heavy was something else, something in a category that did not share vocabulary with fast. He covered the 3 meters between them in a motion that seemed to happen between frames, the kinetic dampeners cycling, the psionic array on the helmet activating, and when he hit Davin the impact was the kind of impact that ended things, the kind of force that buildings were not fully designed to absorb. Davin went backward, and then he did not. Later she would try to describe what she saw and would fail in 3 languages. The closest she came was this. It was like watching something that had been falling toward the ground reverse direction. Not slowly, not with any dramatics. The reversal was simply there, a fact, the way physics was a fact, the way the stars above the pass had been a fact, blazing and clear and indifferent to everything beneath them. Davin's body absorbed the impact, and then the impact was over and he was still standing, and the Baya sequence was not dormant anymore. The Heavy was competent enough to adapt. She gave him that. He had clearly faced Baya-class subjects before he had said so, and his equipment confirmed it, and his adaptations were technically sound. The kinetic dampeners attempted a new cycling pattern. The psionic array switched frequencies. He pressed different angles the way the enforcer on the bluff had pressed different angles, understanding instinctively that if one approach was stopped, you found the next one and the next, and you kept moving. But the Baya sequence had been inside Davin for 11 months. It had learned. It had watched the Directorate's methodology through the controlled tests, through the careful stress, through the 11 months of confinement where the only variable was the Directorate itself. It had studied. It knew all the angles. It reflected the force. Not metaphorically. She watched it happen, the Heavy's own kinetic output, amplified, turned and returned in a single motion that she would later describe to people who asked as the moment she understood what the Directorate had actually created. Not a weapon, not a subject, something the Directorate had no category for. A human body married to an alien organism that had spent 11 months learning the human body's full range, learning its values as well as its biology, learning the distinction between killing and stopping, learning the difference between an organism's survival imperative and a human being's choice. The Heavy went down hard in the frozen field. The carrier began to ascend. Someone in the carrier had made a decision, and the decision was not engagement. She watched it climb, and then it was in the cloud cover, and then it was gone, and the field was silent except for the sound of breathing and the very faint, subsurface creak of frozen ground. Davin stood in the frost with his arms at his sides, and the vascular traces visible through the civilian coat sleeves, bright in the gray morning, and he looked down at the Directorate Heavy, who was alive and concussed, and was going to have a specific kind of nightmare for the rest of his life. And then he looked up at the sky where the carrier had been. He turned around. His face, she thought, was the most human thing she had ever seen on a face that had just done what his face had just seen. Not triumph, not cold resolution. Not the sealed-off expression of someone who has put away the cost of the thing they've just done. Something more than that, more complicated, more honest, the face of someone who is holding two things at once, the fact of what they are and the fact of what they choose to be. "We should move," he said. The former soldier, she noticed, was no longer calculating. He was watching Davin with something entirely different. "Yes," she said, "we should move." The Directorate carrier was out of sight before any of them moved. Lyra counted her own heartbeats, a technique her grandmother had shown her, not mystical, purely practical, a way of metering time when clocks were unavailable and calm was necessary. When she reached 60, she turned to the group. "Spread out, don't walk in a line. If there's aerial still active, a cluster reads differently than scattered individuals. Asa, you know the field boundaries." "Well enough," Asa said. She was already moving, her baker's apron tucked under the civilian coat she'd worn out of the station, her expression the focused neutrality of someone running a problem through a practice checklist. Lyra had known her for 2 years and had never once seen her in a panic, which she found more reassuring than any weapon. The former soldier, he had told her his name once, and she had filed it in the part of her memory reserved for things to ask about later, which was full, crouched beside the Directorate Heavy, and did a brief, efficient check of his vital signs. "Alive," he confirmed. "He'll need medical." "The Directorate will come for him," Lyra said. "Not our responsibility." The soldier looked up at her. "No," he said after a moment, but someone's responsibility. It was a fair point. She acknowledged it and didn't argue it and moved on, because the fair points you couldn't act on in the moment were the ones that accumulated as debt, and she had enough of those already. Davin stood at the edge of the frozen field looking at the space where the carrier had been. She went to stand beside him. Up close, she could see the bayat traces on his forearms settling, the brightness dimming, the warmth receding, the vascular network retreating back toward its dormant signature the way the sea retreats from a shoreline after a wave. His breathing was returning to normal. Whatever the sequence did when fully activated, it apparently had a rest cycle, which was interesting from an engineering perspective and reassuring from the perspective of the next several hours. "You told him you were still afraid of what you might do," she said. "Yes." "Is that true after what just happened?" He turned his forearms over and looked at them, the traces almost invisible now in the gray morning light, especially after what just happened. He looked up, not at her, at the middle distance. That unfocused look she had come to understand meant he was sorting something, running internal calculations. "When it's fully activated, when the sequence takes over the response, I can feel it. I can feel what it wants to do, and what it wants to do is thorough. It wants to be complete. It doesn't have a concept of sufficient. It only has threat neutralized." "But you stopped." "I stopped," he confirmed. "I don't know if I'll always be able to stop." "That's the same calculation a soldier makes every morning they wake up with their training intact," Asa said from nearby, not looking at them, still watching the field boundaries. "It doesn't change whether you walk south." Davin looked at her. After a moment he said, "Were you a soldier?" "Before," she said. "A different kind, the kind that works from the inside." She glanced at him. "You'd have been a useful asset in a different world." "I'm not an asset," he said, not angrily. "I don't think I'm a weapon either, whatever the directorate decided. I think I might just be a person who has," he searched for the word, "options now that I didn't have before." The former soldier, who had stood up from the heavy and was listening to this, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's one way to put it." "Do you have a better one?" The soldier thought about it. He was a compact man, maybe 40, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors in climates that didn't favor human beings. He had, she had noticed, a quality of stillness when not in motion that reminded her of Davin, though where Davin's stillness was the stillness of the transformed, of something vast made quiet by discipline. The soldier's was the stillness of a man who had used up his quota of unnecessary movement a long time ago and saw no reason to restore it. "I was infantry," the soldier said. "Before the occupation I was in the Mountain Corps. We trained for this terrain, these conditions. When they came, I didn't use it like I'd trained. I used it like I needed to, for people who needed me to." He looked at his 2 remaining fingers on his left hand, the gap where the others had been, the result of a scanner confiscation gone wrong or perhaps right, depending on your perspective. "Weapons are things that go where you point them. I stopped going where they pointed me a long time ago." Davin looked at the gap in the man's fingers, nodded slowly. Lyra let them have the moment, and then she said, 2 hours to the river before the patrol rotations align against us. We need to move." They moved. The lowland fields gave way after an hour to what had been, before the occupation, a patchwork of small farms, family plots of winter wheat and root vegetables, the soil dark and heavy under the frost, the fences still standing in most places but the gates taken for scrap by the directorate's logistics teams. The farmhouses were mostly occupied in the technical sense. A family still inside, requisition tags on the doors, the directorate's administrative presence making itself felt in the specific way it felt everywhere. Not as an absence of people, but as an absence of the thing that made people something more than occupants of space. They passed one farm where a light was on in the kitchen window. Lyra felt the house in the deep quiet, 4 people inside, a child among them, all still, all listening to the sound of footsteps passing in the field. She recognized the quality of that listening. She had been that listening once. She had been the child in the kitchen hearing people pass outside and counting her own heartbeats until the sound faded. She let the listening know, in the way she could without words, without stopping, without making anything visible. We are passing through. We are not the ones to be afraid of tonight. She wasn't sure if they could feel it. She had never been sure if anyone could feel the things she sent, whether the deep quiet moved between people the way she experienced it moving, or whether it was something that only went one direction. Her grandmother had said it moved both ways. Her grandmother had said everything that could listen, listened. She had been the kind of person who believed things like that, and the occupation had not persuaded her otherwise, and Lyra had decided, after enough time, to hold that inheritance without testing it too hard. She walked on. A kilometer from the river, Asa stopped them with a raised hand. The patrol was earlier than expected. 2 soldiers on foot, working a grid pattern through the fields, not the road patrol Lyra had planned around, but a secondary sweep she had not felt because they were using the same kind of electronic cover as the bluff enforcer, the neural suppressive field running low and wide, keeping her deep quiet from reaching ahead of them. She had felt it at about 200 meters, which was enough warning but not comfortable. She held up her hand. The group stopped. "How many?" Asa murmured. 2, close. She looked at the field layout, the drainage ditches, the fence lines, the shallow bowl in the terrain to the east that the patrol would have to skirt. If they stay on grid, they'll pass 50 meters north of us in about 4 minutes. And if they don't, then we improvise. Davin said nothing. He was reading the field the way the soldier was reading the field, the same process, different inputs. She could feel him assessing the geometry of the thing, running angles. She thought, 3rd-year aerospace. Someone who knows 17 ways to plot a re-entry trajectory. Someone who understands that the difference between a clean approach and a catastrophic one is often 30 seconds of preparation. "The ditch," he said quietly, pointing east. She looked. He was right. If they moved into the eastern drainage ditch now, the bowl in the terrain would screen them from the patrol's line of sight regardless of whether the soldiers deviated from their grid. It was the better position, and she hadn't seen it first, which she noted without particular self-criticism. She had been doing too many things at once for too many hours, and she was tired, and he had been studying the terrain since the bluff, cataloging it, storing the details the way she suspected the Bea sequence had been storing everything for 11 months, patient and cumulative. "Go," she said. They went. The ditch was cold and wet and smelled of frost and dead vegetation, and they lay flat against its eastern wall in silence, while the patrol passed close enough that she could hear the particular sound of Kethvaran boot tread, which was slightly different from human boot tread. A heavier heel strike, the biomechanics of a physiology that had evolved in lower gravity than this planet's. She had learned to identify it in the dark in the first months of the occupation. Some knowledge you accumulated because you chose to. Some knowledge you accumulated because the alternative was worse. The patrol passed, faded. "Go," Asa said this time. The river crossing was a maintenance bridge, not on the official transit maps, which meant the directorate used it primarily during construction rotations, and it was lightly watched the rest of the time. Lyra had used it twice before, and both times she had gone alone, which was simpler and faster. With 5 others it was neither, but the bridge was wide enough, and the watch post on the south bank was currently understaffed. She could feel the single guard inside the heated shelter, and feel the specific quality of his attention, which was the attention of someone counting down hours and not minutes, someone for whom the current post assignment was a punishment or an oversight. She got them across in 2 groups. Asa and the young woman first, moving along the downstream rail where the shadows were thickest, then herself and the soldier and the formerly silent man. Then she came back for Davin, which she had planned because she wanted a moment alone with him, and because she trusted her own assessment of the guard's attention better than she trusted anyone else's. He came across without incident. Of course, he moved like deep water. On the south bank, in the shelter of a stand of pale frostwood identical to the trees on the bluff where they'd begun this stretch, she let herself feel the full weight of the night for the first time since the transport. Her feet, her shoulders, the fading edge of the neural disruption's echo. The particular exhaustion of using the deep quiet at range for sustained periods. Not physical, exactly, more like the feeling of running at altitude. The oxygen present but thin, the body doing extra work to compensate. She sat on a root and put her face in her hands for a moment. She felt Davin sit beside her. "How far?" he asked. "To the free territories. Another 6 kilometers. We'll be there before dawn." She lifted her face. "How are you?" "Physically, fine. The sequence handles physical recovery." He said this with the mild discomfort of a fact he hadn't entirely made peace with, the fact that his body's recovery was not entirely his body's doing. "Otherwise," he paused, "I've been trying to remember what my sister's laugh sounds like." She looked at him. "I can remember the shape of it, the way her face changes, but not the sound. It might be a side effect of the sequence, some memories are." He stopped. "Or it might just be that I haven't heard it in a long time." "Which do you think?" "I think it's been a long time," he said. "I think when I find her it will come back." He said this the way he said most things, without inflection, flat, the affect of someone who had learned to carry hope carefully because they had dropped it before and understood the cost of that. "I think that's how those things work." "Yes," she said, "that's how those things work." She gave them both another minute of stillness, the frostwood quiet, the river murmuring behind them, the stars beginning to fade at the horizon's eastern edge, and then she stood. They moved south through the lowland fields toward the free territories, free in the sense of not yet occupied, which was different from free in the sense of safe, which was different from free in the sense of permanent. And everyone in the group understood all three distinctions without needing to speak them. The young woman who had said almost nothing since the tram station fell in beside Davin after the first kilometer and began talking to him in a low voice. And Lyra listened as much as she could without making it obvious that she was listening. The young woman had a brother. She had not been able to reach him since the second sweep. She was asking Davin if the network, if there was any way to find out if someone was in a directorate facility. If the psionics who had been taken, if any of them. Davin listened to all of this, and Lyra watched him listening, watched the quality of attention he brought to it, the same quality he had brought to the study of his own changed hands in the depot. Not the fixed attention of someone tolerating a conversation they want to end. The present, careful attention of someone who understands that what is being offered to them is fragile and should be held accordingly. "I was in 2 facilities," he said when she was finished. "I know the intake protocols. I know the subject classification system. I know how they catalog psionics separate from physical enhancement subjects. I know where they keep the files." He paused. "When we get to the free territories, I will tell you everything I know. And then we will find a way to use it." The young woman said nothing. Then she said, "Thank you." He nodded once. Lyra looked forward at the fields and the horizon and thought about her grandmother in the basement with the dried fish and the flatbread, saying, "You are not a weapon, you are not a number, you are my granddaughter and you will outlast them." She had been right about the outlasting. She had not specified what outlasting would look like, which she appreciated now. The space she had left in that prediction. The room for it to be something neither of them could have imagined in the dark below the occupied house, with the boots on the floor above. She opened the deep quiet. Tentatively, the neural disruption rig's effect still fading at the edges of her range, and she felt the land ahead of them, the long cold miles to the border, the checkpoints she would need to ghost through, the 2 patrols intersecting at the river crossing that she would need to time. She felt the weight of the landscape, the patience of it. And at the very edge of her range, she felt the beginning of something that she would later tell people she could not describe, which was true and also not fully true. She could have described it. She chose not to, because some things should be felt by the people who need to feel them rather than handed to them in someone else's words. What she felt was the territory ahead, largely cold, largely dark, and dotted through its darkness with the small, insistent warmth of people who had not gone out. She closed the deep quiet. 2 hours to the river, she said. We'll cross before dawn. They walked in silence for a while, and then from somewhere behind her she heard the former soldier begin to hum, very quietly, not a melody she recognized but something with a shape to it, a call-and-response phrase, the kind of tune you learned from someone who had learned it from someone else, old enough that it no longer remembered where it had come from. After a moment the young woman joined in, a beat behind, and then Asa, and then the silent man who had found his reason to speak by not speaking it. Davin walked beside her and said nothing and hummed nothing, but she felt him at the close-in edge of the deep quiet which was the edge she reserved, when she reserved anything, for the things that mattered listening, really listening. The way he had listened to the young woman, the way he had listened to himself in the depot, hands open in his lap, studying the engineering of what he had become. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the walk was not already saying. 6 kilometers south, the river. Beyond it, uncertain territory. Beyond that, the slow and difficult and necessary work of finding out what came next. She had done difficult work before. She knew the shape of it. You put your feet down and you put them down again, and you did not require the darkness to promise you anything. And when the light came, and it always came, even in occupied towns at gray dawn, even in basements under the boots of strangers, you used it. She put her feet down. The stars above the frozen plain blazed, indifferent and brilliant, the same stars they had stood under in the mountain pass, and below them, walking south through the cold, the small warm fact of human people who had survived the night. By the time the sky shifted from deep gray to the first pale suggestion of blue, they had covered 3 more kilometers. The former soldier was navigating by terrain features now. A ridge of low hills he recognized from before the occupation, landmarks that had preceded the directorate's arrival and would outlast it. The patient geography of a planet that had been here longer than any occupation and expected to be here after. The young woman was walking close to Asa now, the two of them speaking in voices too low to hear, and whatever was being said had changed the young woman's posture. Something in her had unclenched, some held thing released, at least partially, at least for now. Lyra watched the horizon. In the free territories, there would be shelter and contact with the network's southern nodes, and the slow, difficult work of the next thing, finding Davin's sister, finding the young woman's brother, building something usable from the intelligence Davin carried in his changed body and his engineer's memory. It would be the kind of work that did not have a clean end. It would be the kind of work where you measured progress in small gains and did not wait for the moment of final resolution before you allowed yourself to believe it was worth doing. She had been doing that work for a long time. She knew its shape. Davin walked beside her and said nothing and hummed nothing, but she felt him at the close-in edge of the deep quiet which was the edge she reserved, when she reserved anything, for the things that mattered listening, really listening. The way he had listened to the young woman, the way he had listened to himself in the depot, hands open in his lap, studying the engineering of what he had become. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the walk was not already saying. 6 kilometers south, the river. Beyond it, uncertain territory. Beyond that, the slow and difficult and necessary work of finding out what came next. She had done difficult work before. She knew the shape of it. You put your feet down and you put them down again, and you did not require the darkness to promise you anything. And when the light came, and it always came, Even in occupied towns at gray dawn, even in basements under the boots of strangers, you used it. She put her feet down. The stars above the frozen plain blazed, indifferent and brilliant, the same stars they had stood under in the mountain pass, and below them, walking south through the cold, the small warm fact of human people who had survived the night. Lyra walked at the front. Davin walked beside her. And in the deep quiet, very faint, she felt the direction of threat. It was behind them and falling away.